My name is Paul Chappell. I'm the Peace Leadership Director for the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. I graduated from West Point in 2002. I was deployed to Iraq in 2006. I left the Army in 2009 as a captain. And now I work full-time for peace. My focus is peace literacy, which is the idea that if you had a basketball game and nobody is taught how to play basketball, it'd be a mess, and people would understand why it was a mess, because people weren't taught how to play basketball. And if you had an orchestra play Beethoven and nobody was taught how to play their instruments, it would be a mess, and everybody would understand why. Nobody would be shocked. And we have a society and a world where people are not taught basic peace skills. And is it any surprise why the world is messier or more violent than it has to be when we aren't taught these basic peace skills? And so much of what we do learn in our culture actually contradicts what would be helpful for creating a more peaceful world. And when I was at West Point and when I was in the Army, I saw how the military has excellent training in how to wage war, but most activists have no training in how to wage peace. Most people have no training in how to wage peace. Most people are not taught basic peace skills. And what if people were as well trained in waging peace as soldiers are in waging war? And bringing the same level of discipline and strategic thinking to the mission of peace that the military brings to war. And I think that's a really fundamental change in how we view peace as an art and as a science. Think about the amount of time spent on literacy and language. How from preschool through college, students learn language, and even after all that time, people still have trouble writing a persuasive essay or communicating their thoughts in an effective manner. And we recognize how complex language is. And peace literacy is even more complex than literacy in reading and writing, but our society does not prioritize that. So recognizing the need to prioritize peace literacy, and we need to put as much emphasis into developing empathy as we do into language, and how do we bring that level of discipline, strategic thinking to the mission of peace. So it's a skill set where you can use this skill set in relationships, in families, in communities, in workplaces with strangers. You can use these skills for having a healthy country and also for human survival. And if we don't develop these peace literacy skills, we're not going to have the means to solve the root causes of our human problems or these very serious threats to our national and our global security. An idea I heard at West Point was a question posed, and the question was, what causes most of the evil in the world? And people typically think of something like hatred or greed or ignorance, something that seems obviously evil. And the answer I got there was that it's something actually that seems on the surface rather harmless and innocuous. It's what causes most human evil, and the harm that we inflict on others is taking the easy path. Something that seems on the surface very harmless, taking the easy path, choosing the easier wrong over the harder right. So if you think about how much human evil, if we are defining evil as inflicting harm on others, unnecessary harm on others, how much human evil, how much unnecessary harm that we inflict on others is being caused by people simply taking the easy path. For example, it's just easier in the short term to be apathetic, to look the other way. It can seem easier to not challenge injustice. It can seem easier to have slaves. It can be easier to lie. It can be easier to not have integrity. It can seem easier to not take personal responsibility for our actions. Think about how much human harm is caused by people simply not taking personal responsibility for their actions or scapegoating others. It can be easier not to apologize. It can be easier to be apathetic. It can be easier to procrastinate. It can be easier to maintain the status quo. It can be easier to not have empathy. It can be easier to be afraid. That's why we admire courage, because courage is more difficult than fear. That's why we admire people who have courage, because fear is the easier option, right? And it can be more difficult to have courage. There's a quote from Hafiz, the Sufi poet, and he said that fear is the cheapest room in the house. Fear is the easiest option, and a lot of people go for the easiest option when there is a crisis. So how do we instill the healthier option, which requires more effort, which is being courageous in the midst of crisis? Sometimes it can be easier just to kill people. It's not even that you really hate them that much, it's just easier to have them killed. And so, if you look at how much human harm is caused, for example, by apathy, how many unjust systems are, if you really look at what sustains them, is not the evil deeds of the people who perpetuate the harm, but the apathy, the silence of the good people, as Martin Luther King Jr. would say. The apathy, silence of the good people is really what sustains these kinds of systems, and that is what allows injustice to flourish. We have to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. And that is the only way the world can move forward is if we learn how to do that. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, violence can kill the liar, but it cannot kill the lie. So the underlying illusions and myths that sustain injustice, oppression, racism, sexism, environmental destruction, those exist within the human mind, and violence cannot actually get to the root of what's causing that. So we have to transform how people think about issues, and that's where these battles have to be fought, in the sense that we have to be able to transform how people think, and when you transform that to a certain extent, it creates a critical mass, and that critical mass creates new social norms and new laws. So you can't convince every single person that slavery is wrong. You can't convince every single person that women should have the right to vote. But you can convince enough people where you now have new laws in place, where if I told you that I had a slave and it was true, there would be legal consequences for that. And if I showed up on election day and tried to prevent a woman from voting, I would get into legal trouble. So creating critical mass and then new social norms, new laws, and that's how all progress so far throughout human history has happened.